Good morning. For those of you who didn't get the memo, we're starting our new quarter, and we're starting with our view of the Andy Griffith Show, of course, in Bible class. Right. For any of you who did not get a lesson book, I have 2 more copies of the lesson book by Brother Turner, The People of God. And does anybody need the lesson book? And I've also got 1 copy of today's lesson in case. There. And everybody got one they can see? Okay. And as I said on Wednesday night, we will be looking at the questions. I think we're going to be probably taking 2 sessions, Sunday morning and Thursday night, to study each of these lessons. Now, we may get through with some of them in one session, and if that's so, then we'll move on. We'll just take it as it comes. But there will be times when it will be needful that we spread it out a little bit, and maybe there's other times when we don't need to. But one of the things about this study that intrigued me, and of course knowing Robert Turner's name was on it, I knew it was going to be good material, because he spent practically his whole life studying this subject of just what constitutes the people of God. What are they? How do they function? What did God have in mind? And this book takes an approach to it that I've never taken before I read this material. And he just starts at the very beginning with the Scriptures and just moves through it. And he doesn't start into controversial subjects and things like this like most teachers do with this material, but he just starts with the basics. Let's lay the foundation. Once we've laid the foundation of what are the people of God, then we can begin to build on that foundation and go from there. And I think it will become very clear what the answers to some of these questions that brethren have had over the years really are. And the fact is, when we look at the studies of all of the things that have split, and we say the church in America, I'm going to say since the 1700s, I believe the Church of Christ has existed ever since Jesus founded it in Acts chapter 2. In some place in the world, it's existed. But if when Roman Catholicism was writing the history of the world, they found some true worshipers somewhere in southern Rome worshiping according to the Scriptures, all you would have read about them was, we went down and burned some heretics at the stake. So you wouldn't know anything about them other than that, because, Roman Catholicism was writing the history of the world at that time. But what are these people of God? Is everybody a child of God? Start with a basic question. Everybody is. Paul said in Acts 17, we are all the offspring of God. So everybody is a child of God. We were all created by our Maker. Well, what was our purpose in creation? This lesson is really going to get to the heart of that question. When God at the beginning in our book, Genesis 1, said, let us make man in our image. What did he mean by that? Did he mean that man was going to have 2 legs and 2 feet, 2 hands and 2 arms and 2 eyes? And is that what God was talking about when he said, let us make man in our image? Yeah, obviously that couldn't be, because you can't see God. We're told very explicitly, no man has seen God. As a matter of fact, the closest anyone has ever come to seeing God was when Elijah saw the glory of God moving away from him. Essentially, he saw God's back. That's the closest anybody's ever come. Except when Jesus Christ came down to the earth as a man, but he was not in the form of deity at that time. He was in the form of humanity. And so what we saw was his human form. We did not see Jesus in his deity, which he was both at the same time. What does that mean? In one sense, as we said, all people are the people of God. And in Psalm chapter 8, We read, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you visit him? For you have made him a little lower than the angels, and you have crowned him with glory and honor. Now, the word there in Psalm 8, for you've made him a little lower than the angels, is actually the word Elohim, according to the book here, and according to the things that I looked at to study this. They all say that the word here is Elohim. In my Bible, as a matter of fact, in the footnotes, it says Elohim. And Elohim is another word for who? God. Okay? Beth-El, El, God. Okay? And when you see that El in a Hebrew name, that is a word for God. And so Elohim, El being the shortened form of that. And so He made him a little lower than God, is the point here. An object of worship. Yes? You're way beyond my pay grade. If Wayne was in here, he could probably answer that question. I haven't looked that up, so I'm not even going to touch that one. I don't know. Okay. I just don't know. But when we look at Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 11, I think we get an idea here. If somebody will turn to that, I think we get an idea here of what is meant. That man is made just a little bit lower than God, or a little bit lower than the angels, as Psalm 8 says. Someone read that, whoever gets there first. Don't everybody speak up at once. Ecclesiastes 3 and verse 11. Okay. So He set eternity in man's heart. Are animals eternal beings? Is a dog an eternal being? No. There's nothing in there about a soul. The difference when God created the animals, He created them, He put them on the earth, and then it says when He created man, He formed him of the dust of the ground, as the poet said, a piece of clay, and He breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became, and I'm going to butcher this word, I know, Wayne will tell me I pronounced it wrong, man became a living suke, soul. I think that's the right word. And I think I pronounced it somewhere close to right. Man became a living soul. So man has an existence that is different than the existence of an animal. And we have, as it says in Ecclesiastes here, eternity in our hearts. Even the atheist has some sense of eternity in his heart. Think of all of the people in the world that have lived and have wanted to leave a legacy behind them. Even though, somebody told Ronald Reagan one time, don't you care what people think about you after you're gone? He says, no, I'll be dead. I don't care what people on this earth think about me. Now, Ronald Reagan was a believer in God, and he believed in eternity, but he didn't care what this world thought about him after he was gone. But even atheists want something left of them after they're gone from this life. Some kind of a legacy. Because there is that innate sense in every person of eternity, whether they will accept it or not. And that's different from the animals. Animals just don't think about that, as far as we can tell, at least. I've never gotten inside any of my dogs' heads, but and I'm not a dog psychologist, so Can't believe there are dog psychologists, but there are. But at any rate, in Hinduism, men are gods and gods are men. One of their major gods is Lord Krishna. And Lord Krishna lived about 800 years before Christ. Well, he was a man. He was a Brahmin caste Hindu, and they revere him greatly. And they have pictures, I don't know if they actually have pictures of what he looked like or if they have pictures of what they think he looked like. Sort of like we have pictures of Jesus, but he's always a medieval individual with long hair and, a white male, almost always, with, Caucasian features, which wouldn't fit the picture of a Jew. And he's always very handsome, too. That's another thing, that he had no form or comeliness, but he's always handsome in the picture. They revere this guy because they think that that's all God is. He's a man. Now, Pharaoh, when Moses approached Pharaoh, had the same concept of a God. When Moses said, God says, let my people go, well, Pharaoh's thinking, and we don't read this in the text, but we know this from the studies that have been done of their theology of that day. Pharaoh thought, well, who is this God? I'm a God. Why should I listen to this God over here? I'm a God too. So, no, I'm not going to let your people go. Your God's not any more powerful than I am. And, of course, by the end, he found out that he wasn't quite exactly correct on that. But God, if He is a supernatural being, would not be available for discovery by man's test tubes. Who was the guy that came up with the theory of Einstein? I was watching a show on him several years ago, and it was very interesting. Einstein believed in God, but Einstein did not believe in the Bible. And Einstein believed that through mathematics, pure mathematics, he could come to a knowledge of God. And he spent his whole life seeking God, and he was always that far away, according to what he said. He was that close to God so long in his life, but God was just elusive, just a little above him. Well, of course, because mathematics deal with life on this earth. Science deals with things you can put into a test tube and test. And did you know that your own birth is not a scientifically provable fact? You cannot scientifically prove that you were born. Because to be scientifically provable, a thing has to be repeatable. You cannot, as Nicodemus said to the Lord, can I go back into my mother's womb and be born a second time? No, you can't. But we know by deduction and reasoning that everyone who has entered this world has been born into the world. And I am in the world, so therefore I was born. Some people think I was hatched, but that can't be. But that's the limitations of science. And so to find out about God, He had to reveal Himself to us somehow. And how would, if you were a God, let's just take the Bible, put it down here for a minute. If you were a God, if you were a true deity, how would you go about revealing yourself to people? Okay. But just logically speaking, wouldn't you leave some word, some instructions? Of course you would. Because that's the only way it could be done. You wouldn't come down and live among your creation all of the time so that they could see you and just become part of the creation. You would send some word down and some signs to confirm that word. And that's exactly what God has done. So that's, it's a logical thing to do. So when we look at that, we see that we have to look at the Word of God to understand who He is, but there's more than that. We also have to look at the Word of God to understand why we are here. Because we can't ascertain that on our own. If you're an atheist and you think when I'm dead like Rover, dead all over, there's nothing that you can ascertain on your own about how you ought to live. The fact is that Hitler had just as good an idea about how to deal with the world's problems as any other man that ever lived. And Hitler was one of the most brilliant men that ever lived. He had one of the highest IQs there was. But he was totally evil. I believe God used him to fulfill some of His purposes on this earth, to save some souls. But Hitler was a totally evil man. But he relied upon himself to be the standard. Now, I've seen books and I've read books by atheists trying to explain how we know right from wrong. And they're futile. Because all they can assert is, we know this is right. When it comes to morality, you can't know what's right. And you can't know what's wrong. Just innately. It's not there in a way that is concretely provable. Okay. I don't know what you can do with that. It's true. It's true. Yeah, it's true. It is a matter of faith. That's all it is. Now, if we have to go to the Word written by the deity to determine what our purpose is on this life, what does that Word say our purpose is? Somebody turn to Ecclesiastes 12 and let's read verses 13 and 14. Some of you can probably quote this by heart. Okay? You got the New American Standard, right? The New American Standard, this is one of those verses that I prefer the King James. And actually the New King James is even better than the old, I think, because the New King James says, "For this is man's all." This is the whole. Now, King James inserts the word duty in there, but if you look at the word duty, it's in italics, meaning it's not in the original text, it was inserted by the translators. And so when you read the Old King James and you say this is the whole of man, this is our purpose, to fear God and keep His commandments. And so He has to have given us some instructions about how to do that. Now, that's the reason for creation. What was God's reason for creation? That is explained to us in some form in the text of the Bible. But it's quite probable that God didn't explain all of His reasons to us. He gave us all He wanted us to know and all we need to know. But He might have had some things that He didn't explain to us about that. We don't need to speculate about those things. We need to look at the text and we need to understand what it says about His purpose for creating us. Somebody turn to 1 Peter chapter 2, read verses 9 and 10. Okay. So, why were we created? To proclaim the excellencies of God. That's really it. Now, again, the Hindus will take a bunch of flowers And while we were over in India, they had Dasara, which is their fireworks festival, their festival of lights. And they blew up a lot of rupees in the streets of the cities at Dasara, as they say. And they make these gods out of flowers at Dasara. And then they bow down and they worship those gods. And then they rise up the next morning and they take those gods all apart. And in one place we were, they were dismantling the temple that they had built. It was a temporary structure that they had built in one of the streets in Shantinagar. And they were dismantling all of that, and they were filling it up with ladies' clothing, and they were selling ladies' clothing out of there the next day before they tore the structure down. Now wait a minute. You build a god, you bow down and worship the god, and then you tear the god apart. Does that make a lot of sense? Isaiah talks about that, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. But let's understand something. God has always chosen a special people for Himself. From the beginning of time, God created Adam and Adam and Eve sinned, and they were cast out of the garden. Adam knew his wife Eve, and she bore him Cain. Then she bore him Abel. No, wait a minute. Was it Abel and then Cain? Cain, then Abel. Cain was the oldest, sorry. She bore him Cain, and then she bore him Abel. Cain, of course, murdered Abel and was cast out of the presence of God. And it says in chapter 4, and in chapter 5, all of this is talked about, that he knew his wife again, and she bore him Seth. Seth is actually called a man after Adam's own image. Now, I don't know if that means that he looked a lot like his father. It's very possible that's what that means there. But who was the chosen one of those three sons? Seth. And yes, we have some of the descendants of Cain mentioned. It's quite possible that that lineage of Cain is mentioned down till the flood, when it would have ended for sure then, but maybe not. But he mentions a few of the descendants of Cain, and they're pretty much all bad people. Then he mentions the descendants of Seth, and he comes down to Noah. And Noah, again, was chosen by God to carry on the lineage. Someone read Genesis chapter 5, verses 21 through 24. Yes. I skipped Enoch, and I meant to mention Enoch and the lineage there. So we're backing up a little bit. Enoch was another man who was chosen by God. And Hebrews says that God translated Enoch so that he did not taste death. So we know what happened to Enoch. He didn't die. He went straight into God's presence in eternity, and because he was a righteous man. And then Noah, being his grandson, or great-grandson, then was chosen because Noah did what was right when all the world was evil. And so God again had a chosen people at the time of the flood. Then in Genesis chapter 11 and verse 10, we see God choosing someone else. And who was that? First name mentioned, Shem. Of Noah's 3 sons, now 2 of them were apparently righteous, because it was Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and it was Ham that went in and saw his father lying naked and drunk, and went to his brothers, apparently laughing about it. His brothers backed into the room so that they did not see their father and covered him up out of respect. Well, apparently Japheth and Shem were both at least fairly righteous men, but it was Shem who was chosen. Now we come down to Abraham. And in chapter 13, in verse 1 we read, "So Abraham went up from Egypt to the Negev, he and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him." This is after God called Abraham to get out of his country, Ur of the Chaldees, and go to a land that God would show him. And Abraham, acting in faith, went. Now, was Abraham the only man at that time that was faithful to God? We don't know. That would be speculation. But probably not, I would guess. But Abraham was chosen by God as a special generation or a special people of God. And then God promised Abraham that he would have a son, and that this son would be the one through whom all nations of the earth would be blessed. And Abraham had a son, and his name was Ishmael. Was Ishmael chosen? He was the firstborn. He should have gotten the birthright. No. Who was chosen before he was born? There's only one other son. What? Isaac. Yeah. Before he was ever born, Isaac was chosen by God to be the one through whom the lineage of God's special people would come in the Old Covenant. Isaac hadn't done anything to deserve that, had he? Not at all. We might say this was predestination, which it was. I'm supposed to be talking about predestination in my next trip to India, so I'll try not to bleed over too much there in this study, because it's not what we're studying here. But Isaac was chosen before he was born, and then Isaac had two sons, and while they were still in the womb, what was said about them? Exactly, the older would serve the younger. Esau, being the firstborn, should have gotten the birthright, but it was said he would serve his younger brother, Jacob. Jacob was chosen again, not because Jacob was worthy, not because Jacob had done anything at all, but he was chosen before he was born by God again to be the one through whom all nations of the earth would be blessed. He was the chosen generation. And then we look at, and this is something that really, until we took the book of Genesis over to India and began to study it, I didn't hit me, but hit me there, and I've always thought it was interesting. Which one of Jacob's wives was actually chosen to be the predominant wife? Jacob met Rachel, and he loved Rachel, but Leah had the weak eyes. Leah was chosen to be the predominant one. Leah had the firstborn son, Reuben. Was Reuben chosen? No. Simeon was the second-born son. Was he chosen? Levi, the third-born son, was he chosen? Judah was chosen, the fourth-born son, and whose mother was Judah? Leah. Christ came through the lineage of Judah, through David, who was a Judahite. However you say it, Judah, a member of the tribe of Judah. And so Judah, the fourth-born son, was the one chosen by God to be the predominant one, through whom the Messiah would come. Not because of anything that he had done, but again, because God chose him. Now, when Israel is gathered up in Deuteronomy chapter 7, God tells them something about His choice of them. Deuteronomy 7, verses 6 through 8. Someone read that for us. Okay? Again, God chose a special people to be His own people, to be His true children. But it was not because they were righteous. It was not because they were mighty. It was not because there was really anything special about them, but it was because God loved them and because He was fulfilling the promise that He had made to their fathers. So again, we have God choosing special people. Now we come down to 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 and 10 that we looked at just a few minutes ago. And we have the people of God being His special people in the New Testament to glorify Him. Now, it's always been the purpose of God to choose people to be His special people for the purpose of glorifying Him and carrying out His plan for this earth. So, this is a very important thing for us to understand. God has always chosen someone over someone else. And, we might here again say, He hasn't chosen us because we're sinlessly perfect. He hasn't chosen us because we're so much better than anyone else. I was thinking the other day about some of the kids I grew up with whose parents were drug addicts and things like this, and I was thanking God for the godly parents that I had. Because, I may have been a worthless individual if I had grown up with parents other than the ones I had that taught me the Word of God from my youth up. Wasn't me that did anything to deserve them. But God gave me to them, and they did their job. And I thank God for that because, as I say, there go I, but for the grace of God. Now the Athenians in Acts chapter 17 were servers of God, or so they thought. They had all of these altars built. And if you go over to India, you've seen the slide that I've got there of all the little altars all over the place. Every kilometer you drive down the highway, you're going to see some kind of an altar or some kind of a god that was built by human being. Turn to Isaiah chapter 44 and let's read verses, I think I wrote 12 through 17. Isaiah 44. Let me make sure that's the right verses before somebody reads it. Yeah, 12 through 17, 5 verses. Now turn to Acts chapter 17. Read verses 24 and 25. If you want to, you can just read it out of the book here. On page 2. Top paragraph of the book. Whoever gets there first. We've all heard the story of Alexander Graham Bell inventing the telephone. He was a great inventor. But he invented the telephone, and what was the first thing he did with it? According to the story, at least. He called out to his assistant in the other room and said, "Watson, come here." Did he invent the telephone and then turn down and start bowing down to worship it? Of course not. He expected the telephone to serve him because he had created it. Now, does it really make sense for me to go out here and create a God and then expect that I should serve that God that I created? The lesser comes from the greater, not the greater from the lesser. And so people will say to us, "Well, I don't see how God just can expect me to just worship Him." And I've had that thrown in my teeth. People are trying to argue against the presence of the Almighty God. Well, He just doesn't have the right to do what He decided to do. I said, well, He's God. He made you. He can do with you what He pleases. Just like the potter on a potter's wheel, as was described, I believe it was either Isaiah or Daniel that talked about the potter forming the clay on the potter's wheel, and somehow the clay didn't turn out to be what he wanted it to, and he smashed it, and he made a lump. He made it back into a lump, and he started over because it didn't turn out like he wanted it. And so a creator has the right to expect his creation to serve him, and not the other way around. In Romans 1, it talks about the sinfulness of man and the downhill slide really at the end of chapter 1. Let's look at verses 28 through the end of the chapter. Whoever gets there first, read that for us. Okay. The downhill slide of sin isn't, like when you're on the 20th story of that high-rise building and the elevator door opens up and there's no elevator there. As they say, watch that first step. I think it was a TV show one time that the cliffhanger ending of the thing, the elevator door opened up and one of the main characters walked into it and there was no elevator there. And then they shut the show down. Then they blacked out the screen at that point. That's not the way it works. It's a one step at a time thing. We start out by refusing to have God in our knowledge and saying, oh, He can't exist. And then the next thing we do, we start to take that next step down to the path of sin. When we look at today in our country, isn't that the way we're headed right now? Absolutely. We're calling good evil and we're calling evil good. All manner of evil is considered to be fine. It's considered to be good and proper and honest for a man to receive a check from the government without working for any of it. But God said, if a man will not work, neither let him eat. And I think we're at time to quit, aren't we? 3 minutes? All right, I'll finish this point then. That'll give me just enough time. But we turn around and we take the things that are actually good and we say, oh, those things are bad. And we take the things that are bad and we say those things are good. And we make policies. For example, I was reading just the other day that in the military, sexual assaults and things of this nature have gone up almost 500% in the military. And it's because of the policies that have been instituted in the last few years that have allowed this kind of atmosphere to enter into the military. Before it wasn't this way. But now we're exercising policies that are bad, and now the people that are doing it, I just can't understand why all of this bad stuff is happening. Well, because you're doing bad stuff. You're putting bad policies in place. You know, people are out now protesting against police. We got to do away with the police. You really want to do that? You really want to do that? Let's just do away with the police. I'll tell you what, in Birmingham, Alabama, back in the 60s, in the one section of town, they were protesting the police so much, the police commissioner said, all the officers get out. They don't want us in there. Get all the firefighters and all the police officers out of there. You know how long that lasted? 24 hours. And the leaders of that community were up there at City Hall, please bring the police back. They're going to kill all of us. You know, you can't have anarchy and have anything good. Now, there are bad police officers. I've run into a couple of them. A friend of mine one time got into an argument with a police officer on the street, and his wife with her 2 little children in the car, they both of them were as angry as they could be. She thought that cop was just going to shoot her husband right there in front of her little children. And when they got to the judge reprimanded the police officer and told him he was wrong. And then he turned around and fined my friend for interfering with a police officer in the performance of his duties. He said, the next time you have an argument with a police officer, young man, you bring it to me because that's why I make the big bucks. You take the ticket and you take it to court. That's what I'm here for. We cannot abandon the principles of righteousness and expect good results. That's the point. And so we're going to close the class right there. And we'll take up there next on Thursday night.